Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar. Thank you very much indeed for coming. It's great to see so many people on the webinar, and we hope you find it interesting and enjoyable. So today we're going to look at the impact which COVID-19 has had on landed estates over the past few months, and perhaps more excitingly, the opportunities which might arise from COVID-19. So our presenters today are Simon Pring, who is a partner in the rural property team at Farrers, Liz Hartless, who's a partner in the private wealth and estates group at Saffrey, and Mark Ashbridge, who's the founder and managing partner of Ashbridge Partners. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're conscious that the vast majority of the participants on this call are involved in running or advising estates of different types and in different parts of the country. And hence we thought it would be useful to give you all a quick summary of how some of the estates which the four of us have been involved with have been faring, and what steps they might have been taking to lessen the impact of COVID-19. These days, the vast majority of rural estates are thankfully very diverse, and they've been hit in some very different ways. They've got some enterprises which haven't been hit at all, and they've got some enterprises which have been completely and utterly decimated. Just going through a few examples. So combinable crop farming. Well, harvest has started, you'll have all seen out your windows. Very mixed results so far, largely as a result of a very, very wet winter, difficult drilling conditions, and a very dry spring, pretty much a drought in certainly east of England. Salad farming. Well, I'm sure you'll all remember back at the start of lockdown, we were terrified and really, really concerned about where all the salad pickers were going to come from. But the gentle release of lockdown over the past month or so has pretty much sorted this. We've got flights back up and running to Stansted. They're bringing those pickers in from the rest of the EU. Residential lettings, well, they're largely holding up really well. The vast majority of tenants are paying their rents, and most are finding that even if they've been furloughed, their discretionary expenditure has fallen significantly. Unless, like my wife, you're actually an Amazon addict, but most are paying their rents and most are paying on time and paying in full. Most estates have some commercial lettings, very, very much more of a mixed bag. So overall, light industrial rents have pretty much been paid in full. A number of those businesses on estates have continued operating throughout lockdown, so they've continued to service their clients and they've continued to pay their rents. We found offices more of a challenge. The average across our Bidwells managed estates is between 60 and 70% who've paid in full, and the remaining 30–40% are on some sort of revised payment plan, but the vast majority are paying to some extent. On the other hand, retail and hospitality has largely fallen off a cliff. Only 30% so far have paid in full, and there are 70% who either haven't paid at all or they're on payment plans. A few who very sadly already handed their keys back. So let's hope that reopening over the past 3 or 4 weeks and Rishi Sunak's discounts during August on hospitality and food and restaurants, let's hope that will help them. I know Simon will talk a little bit about wedding venues and hospitality, but pretty much all of them have seen the vast majority of their weddings this year move to next year. The busiest season for them is generally April to September, and I suspect overall 90% of those weddings falling in those months have been postponed until next year. House openings, well, they have all been closed. The majority of the house staff have been furloughed, but some are now gradually over the past couple of weeks starting to reopen. I read in the Times this morning that Chatsworth is opening its doors again on Monday morning. That's good news. Tourist attractions, well again, all have been closed. The vast majority of their staff have been furloughed. Many are reopening, many are desperate to take advantage of the summer weather, desperate to take advantage of the school holidays, and they're moving to open over the next week or two. I'm sure there are many other enterprises I've forgotten about, and which my 3 co-presenters will cover in today's presentation. Can I encourage you, rather than using the chat button, please ask questions via the Q&A button down at the bottom of the screen. And my suggestion is we leave these until the end of the webinar, and then we take them all together when we have all 4 presenters back on the screen. Now, we've got an hour this morning in case we need it, but we're aiming to finish within about 45 minutes. So without further ado, I'll introduce Simon Pring, who will talk about some of his experiences dealing with estates during COVID-19. Liz will then talk about law and tax, and Mark will talk about the economy and finance. But over to Simon. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giles. Can you thumbs up to hear me? Oh, he's gone. Never mind. I'm assuming you can all hear me. Welcome, everybody. Giles has done a very good resume of what's going on with rents generally, so I won't repeat that. we're seeing largely that estates are faring quite well with their rents, particularly in the agricultural sector, and agriculture and residential. The hospitality is a disaster. What we're also seeing, though, with the holiday letting industry, particularly in the West Country, is that booking rates since the easing lockdown have been extremely encouraging, and anecdotally we're hearing that premium rates are being able to be charged for a longer period right out through to September. So those businesses may not look quite as bad as they're suggesting, but we'll know more on the September, when it comes to the September rent day. What's mostly happening, other than those that are complete hospitality like pubs, is that we're deferring rents rather than waiving them, and we'll review the position later, but I'm sure there'll need to be a general sharing of pain. What's more interesting is what's happening in relation to future opportunities. The increased desire to live and work in rural areas and the effect of this not only on house rental values but also office rentals is marked, and we feel is likely to be sustained. With rural office rentals being more robust, this will change the dynamic and make some of what were quite frankly non-viable restoration of old buildings viable again, which is very good news for estates with a lot of old buildings that aren't quite ready for residential development. The country house market has also taken off with a vengeance, but again, anecdotally, the only thing holding it back being the supply. There just aren't enough of the houses. One thing that is of particular interest to us at Farrers is the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission and the work we've been doing on placemaking. And we feel it will be increasingly important with the extensive development that the government is planning to build places in which people actually want to live and where they're also able to an extent to work and to exercise. Another great opportunity we see is the potential sustained increase in the staycation industry. And for some estates, maybe now is the time to look again at rental portfolios and whether some of the permanent residential lettings should be moved towards holiday and B&B or Airbnb lettings. Recognizing, of course, this can conflict with many estate owners' desire to maintain year-round vibrant communities. On a larger scale development, we think estates should be looking to investigate their proximity to electrical infrastructure. Grid capacity is crucial for solar farms and battery barns. I would just mention there are a proliferation of developer-friendly heads of terms floating around, and estates should get professional advice because those heads of terms should not be signed. Also, the importance of the proximity to road infrastructure, both now and planned. I think this is essential for estates to develop more car accessible office developments, which people want. They don't want to be getting on trains if they can help it. There will be an increased demand for charging sites for electric cars, although here again there's particular need for specialist advice on rent review patterns and the terms. But I think those will get through planning quite easily. And then rather more controversially, but I think very importantly, the exploitation of mineral assets, particularly in the light of the government's announced increased infrastructure plans and the need to be a little bit more proactive. Here also access to rail infrastructure is relevant. We are anticipating significant new infrastructure being announced by the government, whether this is actually new or whether they're dressing up previous plans. We are, and this is important, increasingly seeing developers who are pursuing their own development consent orders, giving themselves compulsory powers. If you think you might be subject to one of these, take advice early would be my recommendation, as you don't want to end up with compulsory purchase valuations. And they're not really COVID linked, but more generally, the changing subsidy regime and the increased emphasis on greening is going to have a big effect on estates. And this led to the Environment Bill and the biodiversity net gain. Opportunities for biodiversity net gain could be very significant for estates, but it does depend very much on where your land is situated in relation to larger proposed developments. And I think that's quite enough from me. Now I'm going to hand over to Liz, who's going to take up the baton on tax, of which there are plenty of flagged changes. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Simon. Hopefully you can all hear me. So in terms of our clients' experiences during the pandemic, we've seen a great uptake of the furlough scheme, and our payroll team have been very busy processing this for clients that we operate payroll for. One client the other day commented that the scheme has been a real lifeline. The £1,000 retention bonus, be nice if it was £100,000, is of course very welcome. However, quite a few clients have said they are not sure it is really enough to incentivise people to retain staff long term. I have heard of some houses that are not planning on opening at all in the 2020 season due to the costs associated with reopening for only half the season. Those on the agricultural side have largely seen business as usual, although we did have some clients worrying about the supply of workers early on in lockdown, as Giles mentioned. Some were even considering chartering planes to ensure their supply of labour. As Giles said, this fear has lessened since restrictions have eased. Demand for local delivery schemes like veg boxes and milk delivery have thrived during lockdown, with one national scheme having a wait list of 6,700 customers at one point during lockdown. Such demand has enabled some businesses to expand and also for some new entrants to the consumer market, particularly those who were previously supplying the hospitality sector. Hopefully the virus has shone the spotlight on local producers and means that customers will continue to shop more locally going forwards. The internet is key to this, and it is encouraging to see that one of the amendments put forward by the House of Lords to the Agricultural Bill this week was for access to reliable broadband for farmers. Although this issue was deemed out of scope of the Agricultural Bill, such debate helps to highlight the importance of connectivity for rural businesses. As Simon mentioned, the staycation industry is booming since restrictions eased at the start of July, and Simon mentioned a possible switch from long-term lets to furnished holiday accommodation. We have seen some interest in this, and it's important to consider the tax implications, as furnished holiday lets have special tax rules, particularly around loss relief, deductibility of finance costs, and CGT reliefs. There may also be VAT considerations if VAT was incurred on a previous refurbishment, and it may be possible to revisit that previous VAT recovery position. Clearly, weddings and other hospitality activities have been severely hit, as Simon and Giles both mentioned. Whilst it is hard to think of the opportunities the pandemic may have had for this sector, social distancing has highlighted that the rules regarding outdoor weddings in England and Wales are perhaps somewhat out of date. The Law Commission has been reviewing the current rules since July 2019 and is planning on publishing its consultation paper this September. One of the areas under review is whether outdoor weddings should be allowed in England and Wales without the need for a fixed permanent structure, which could open up the market to other landowners and also mean that current wedding businesses have more freedom over where weddings take place on their land. Where tenants have been struggling, as Giles and Simon both mentioned, we've also seen rent deferrals rather than waivers, and some of the worst hits have clearly been the commercial tenants. We've actually seen some tenants and landlords coming up with quite innovative solutions that work for both sides, such as turnover-based rents, so that they can each take a share of the pain. Regarding inheritance tax and capital gains tax, and even a possible wealth tax, these topics continue to come up in the news, and July has been a very busy month in this regard. The Office of Tax Simplification has launched a call for evidence into capital gains tax, CGT. My personal view is that this is potentially quite a shrewd timing on the part of the Chancellor. Such an announcement signals that changes may be afoot and encourages owners of capital assets to get transacting, triggering CGT now at an apparently palatable rate and getting CGT into the coffers by 31st of January 2022, or in the case of residential property, within 30 days following the changes introduced in April this year. If this is successful, I wonder whether the 30-day reporting window may be extended to other assets where cash is usually available immediately on disposal, for instance, quoted securities being disposed of by brokers. The fear of CGT changes is prompting many families to have discussions about succession planning with a view to passing on assets. And in some cases, this is bringing the next generation into business discussions at perhaps an earlier age than it otherwise would have been, which is usually no bad thing. Coupled with potential changes to inheritance tax, which are widely expected following various reviews in recent years, this is providing further motivation for clients to have discussions about succession. I won't focus on wealth taxes, save to say that this month, the Institute for Fiscal Studies launched a review into such a tax. They highlight that there are many practical problems and will release their final report in December. However, they have been at pains to state that they are merely reviewing the idea, and it does not mean that a wealth tax is coming. In fact, the Prime Minister dismissed the idea in Prime Minister's questions just before the summer statement. What we do know is that the virus and lockdown have been hugely expensive for the government and will need to be paid for, and perhaps we will see new taxes being introduced, particularly in the environmental space, as the government focuses on the COP26 summit next year and its ambitious net zero targets. Capital taxes like CGT and IHT are not the big levers for the Chancellor. For that, he has to look to income tax, national insurance, VAT and corporation tax, the first three of which are subject to the triple lock promised in the Conservative election manifesto. Therefore, it's very hard to guess what the Chancellor will do, and we await the autumn budget with interest. VAT was one of the big stories from the summer statement and has been welcomed by those in the hospitality industry, albeit with a tight time frame to implement changes. There is some debate around whether businesses should be passing the VAT saving on to customers, and in general we've seen the big national and international chains like Nando's and McDonald's publicising the fact that they are passing it on, whereas smaller family-run businesses are broadly planning on retaining the saving to help recoup losses incurred in recent months. The Chancellor highlighted it is for each business to decide, and we are suggesting clients have a statement prepared for such questions and to ensure that staff are briefed if customers ask. Understandably, during the crisis, we've seen an increasing focus on cash flow and the need for more real-time financial information, including more interest in cloud accounting to help with this, especially with many estate offices working more remotely. I'd be interested to hear what Mark has seen regarding the financial information needed to secure funding. Longer term, more digital management information, underpinned of course by better rural internet connection, has got to be a good thing. And this is something that we see the next generation in particular getting interested in, as they're more used to having information accessible at the touch of a button. Finally, low interest rates are clearly an opportunity at the moment for those looking to borrow, and I'll now hand over to Mark, who I'm sure will talk more about this.
Liz, thank you very much. A perfect introduction. So I'm going to talk about the banking world, and I'm going to split into three sections. So first of all, what I call the headlines of what's happened, then look at the bank response to the crisis, and then come back to the opportunities. It's very interesting to compare this recent period with that of 2008. In 2008, banks were much weaker than they are today, and it's very positive that the regulator has driven those financial institutions to strengthen their balance sheets. So it means that actually they stand in a very strong position to cope with the fallout from this situation. We've also seen historically low rates since 2009. I remember, I think it was March 2009 when base rate dropped to 0.5%, and it has pretty much stayed at that level or bounced a little above and a little below over the subsequent 11 years. Now, 2-3 months ago, the Bank of England dropped rates to 0.1%, which takes us to an all new low and exacerbates that trend of very, very low interest rates. Of course, that's been a boon to variable rate borrowers, reducing their cost by 0.65%. it won't have had an impact on existing fixed rate borrowers, but anybody taking up a fixed rate today will find that fixed rates, the underlying cost of funds of fixed rates, are lower than they would have been certainly before COVID. The other side of the coin, and this is an important point, is that the banks ultimately need to make a profit too. And what we find is that as interest rates go lower, then profitability in banks is hit harder and harder. So they've been operating in this period of 10, 11 years where they've been quite challenged in terms of the level of profit that they're able to make. And without going into lots of detail, it's very much related to the fact that many bank accounts in credit wouldn't ordinarily pay any interest, but of course, as it's all related to the differential between the lending rate and the deposit rate, and that's of course being squeezed. I think that the impact of that, and I keep in close touch with the banks that we work with, is that ultimately there will need to be an uptick in interest margins. Now, at this moment in time, we haven't seen any immediate evidence of that. Perhaps maybe the occasional case where a sort of slightly harder view is taken, but that hasn't fed through quite yet. Normally, from experience, I find that the banking world does move relatively slowly. So it may be something that we see in the coming months. All of that said, estates, and as my colleagues have said before me, have been largely protected and in many cases unaffected by the outcome of the pandemic. And so the combination of all of that means that estates are still very attractive businesses to lend to. So that's the headlines. The bank response to the pandemic, what we've seen is capital repayment holidays to aid cash flow, overdraft extensions to do the same. The government have introduced their government-backed loans, what's known as the Sybil loan, which is potentially up to 5 million, or the bounce-back loan, which actually arguably has been much more successful, or the uptake of it has been, because it's been a very straightforward process in order to meet the hurdles. What we've also seen is that lenders have typically focused their resources, both in manpower and capital, on existing customers, which obviously is good for existing customers, but for new borrowers out there looking for new money, then that has blocked them out of certain opportunities with certain lenders. I've talked about the resource and capacity issues. Certainly, from a practical level, many bank workers working from home, broadband issues, internal technology issues, where for some of the high street lenders where they've got offshore service centres, perhaps in India, for example, they have been closed down for periods of time, or certainly significantly impacted. So that's all had a very big implication for the amount of applications which are going through the banks at any one time. So in short, what we've seen is a great slowing up as a result of that. However, a number of perhaps smaller banks, private banks, who have perhaps weathered this better in the sense of their ability to react and respond, and their personnel have actually taken the opportunity to take on some new and good quality business. So just moving on now finally to the opportunity. What I've said for some time is that landed estates and farms have a competitive advantage against many other businesses, many other borrowers or the sectors in the banking world. And why is that? Well, perhaps two key reasons. In a historical sense, their default rate is very, very low compared to any other sector. And by default, because of the low yield of low yielding assets, then they tend to have pretty strong capital bases. And so what does this mean? Well, it means that they have access to more flexible loan structures. So they probably can obtain longer committed terms of 10 years, 15, 20, 25, and even 30 years, whereas other sectors might be restricted to 5 or 10 years. They also, again, partly because of the low default rate, get more competitive terms, so ultimately cheaper money. And then on top of that, because of those other two factors, because they can get committed terms for longer periods of time, then they've also got access to fixed rates. And so it means that they can go into the market and secure, for example, 10-year fixes interest only, or 20 or even 30-year fixes, typically amortized, but in some occasions on an interest-only basis. Now, in terms of examples, if we look at, for example, investing into commercial property, which a number of larger estates have done in the last 5 years, and that's something that we've been involved with and raising monies for them on that basis, it means that they've been able to borrow money long term, so in certain cases 30 years fixed, but amortized at 3.5%, and they're investing into assets which are yielding 6, 7, 8, and even 9%. We've seen, and so therefore that can both service and repay the debt, and often leave a margin. So that's helpful. Also, coming back to what my colleagues of Simon and Liz, I think both mentioned it, reassessing opportunities on the estate in the light of this stronger appetite for perhaps rural office space, or for holiday lets, or for residential. And that, coupled with the unprecedented low cost of money, both short term and long term, and ability to raise that money, I think makes a great opportunity. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Giles.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Liz, thank you. And Simon, thank you. I thought that was a fascinating talk through our own experiences and our own experience of the States, and from different perspectives what they've been doing. We've got a few questions coming in. I'm just going to start with one to Simon. Simon, in terms of residential development, is it fair to say that actually that hasn't fallen off a cliff? Things are still going ahead, things are still moving and happening?
Yes, very much so. In fact, the builders are out there. They're looking for shovel-ready sites, I think. But the bigger developments are still going ahead. We've been signing up some really quite significant promotion agreements during lockdown, and the major infrastructure is open. The major infrastructure that's planned, the East-West Railway, and some of the roads around the country are opening up some serious development opportunities. So I think the greenfield development is still there. How it's delivered, however, is another matter, and there are some, without putting Liz on the spot on the tax implications of keeping deferred interests in developments, a lot of landowners are looking to do some more placemaking, increase the design input from the landowner, and look to extract increased value over the long term that gives. But as I say, it can cause a few tax issues, but no tax issue is insurmountable.
Thank you, Simon.
Sorry, if I could just jump in there. We have actually been sort of in discussion. It's very initial and a bit sort of pie in the sky at the moment, but discussions about what could be done in terms of tax to incentivize or not to disincentivize landowners from bringing developments forward where they still want to be involved in the design process and, you know, still have a say over that placemaking, which is becoming, I think, increasingly important. And the Building Better, Building Beautiful campaign that Simon mentioned earlier, I think is a really good initiative, and I do hope it gets more traction from government.
Thank you, Liz. And just staying with Liz, if we can, I was going to ask another question which has come in about ownership structures. You talked about capital gains tax, and I think probably everyone on the panel is sitting here thinking that's going to change. In other words, it's going to go up at some stage very soon. Is it an opportunity for bigger estates to look at ownership structures now, as well as passing things down to the next generation, perhaps actually looking at restructuring what they've got, restructuring how assets are held and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're thinking about any changes in terms of ownership, be that passing on to the next generation or changing your own operating structure, maybe to include a corporate, because I know quite a few estates have considered that. I think it's definitely better to get on and do it in the current known environment rather than waiting. There's always the sort of caveat that you don't want to rush to do things just for tax and trigger tax charges just for the sake of it. I had one client who rushed to do something before the budget in March because they were convinced that CGT rates were going to rise then. And actually the timing of it with the markets suddenly sliding the week of the budget was just a nightmare. And, you know, with hindsight, you wouldn't want to go anywhere near that sort of planning.
Yeah, understood. Thank you, Liz. Moving to Mark. Mark, we've had a few questions largely directed to you, and I'm just going to read one comment, if I may, from Jason Borthwick. Just like to say that the bank response has been shocking. The announcements from the government of what the banks would offer has been good, but sadly the banks haven't offered what was promised. Some businesses have got what they need, but for many, many businesses, the banks have utterly failed to help, and certainly haven't helped as a response to the help they received themselves in the financial crisis. Very disappointing. Can you comment on that, on Jason's point?
Yeah, I think there's two things I'd say. One is picking up on the issue I raised earlier, which is resources. I mean, the human resource of the banks, particularly the high street banks, has been really, really impeded, both in terms of the back office and the front office. And you know, I've had conversations with some banks where, you know, they're telling me that rather than having X number of credit applications, you know, going before credit at any one time, it's probably X times 4, X times 5. So, you know, there's a certain timeline that it takes to get through, and in our view, often that's too long anyway in a normal time. So I'm just, you know, well aware that through the normal channels, there is enormous delay. That's before you even get the chance to have a decision. The other point is that I appreciate the government have brought forward, first of all, this CBIL scheme, this CBIL government-backed loan, which looked brilliant on the face of it. The challenge has been the hurdles that the business has to meet in order to qualify for it. Things like, for example, of course, if your lender wasn't an accredited lender, and quite a number weren't, then, well, they couldn't do it in the first place, but then they've gone through a process of becoming accredited, and so maybe 2 months later, 3 months later, they are then accredited, then they've got to implement it. So that's that one issue. Then in an estate sense, and I didn't really have time to say this, but actually in the estate world, then the CBIL loan is not really that relevant, because the structure of it is that, yes, okay, I mean, great, if you can get over the hurdles and meet the criteria, then you get to borrow the money and you get 12 months of the interest paid for by the government, but then you've got to repay it over 5 years. And you know, the estate businesses typically are either borrowing money interest only long term, or they are amortizing debt over, say, 25-year terms. So it wouldn't typically work. So I completely sympathise with with what's being said there, and I think in a normal environment, going to the bank to raise money is a very, very elongated process, and it's about going to the right place with the right information, with the right package, in order to get the result. So obviously I'd love to know more details, sort of offline, but yeah, I have enormous sympathy.
Thank you, Mark. Simon, I'm going to turn to you now, if I may. A question has come in from John Hoy. Thank you, John. How worried should the landed estate sector be about a no-deal Brexit at the end of 2020, leaving on WTA rules, as it seems to be the most likely outcome based on current progress? Can you give us a lawyer's view on that?
Well, I saw that question. I thought that's absolutely a land agent's one, that one. But John probably knows the answers more than anyone else. I think it's like all of these things, we won't know really how it's going to pan out until it happens. It's like all of these things on the estates. I think we need to just not panic and take an iterative approach to it. I mean, the government has promised to keep up the payments to the agricultural sector to make things viable, although with the amount they've spent now, might they review that? I don't know if those are set in stone, but equally I think a lot of people are buying more locally, so we may see a shift, and there may be pressure on agricultural rents going forward, but I don't know, one for you really. What do you think?
Thank you, Simon. I agree with all of that. And I think probably what I would say is we've started the presentation by saying estates are increasingly diverse. And my strong view is that the most diverse estates will get through this in the best way. We have to be willing to react very quickly. We have to be willing to think very quickly, and we have to be willing to change. Most estates and the most diverse estates have changed, and they have got a number of different assets and income streams which have now moved slightly away from agriculture. Agriculture has been very helpful over the past 3 or 4 months, but perhaps some of the other income streams will be better over the next 2 or 3 years. But no, thank you, John, for raising that. I'm going to turn to Liz. I would be interested in the panel's view on issues surrounding business interruption claims and whether there are examples of successful claims in light of recent high-profile cases. Are you happy to take that one?
I am, although Mark probably might have something to say on that as well. I think our experience is we have had some clients who have gone for the interruption loans, and we've helped in terms of cash flow forecasting, which has obviously been a key factor there, working out how they're going to be able to service that and repay. I think that the sense seems to be that the landed estates have not taken up a huge amount of those sorts of loans, because either their existing banks have extended existing facilities, or they've just sort of been directed to other borrowing options by their banks. Mark, I don't know if you've got any views on that.
Liz, yeah, I completely agree with that. As I sort of said before, I think the Sybil loan is not that relevant in our sector. The bounce back loan, I mean, it may be that a number of smaller businesses have chosen to take that up because it was a sort of 10-minute exercise, I think, to complete, and you got the money the next day. Thanks very much. But yeah, otherwise, I completely agree.
Mark, can we stay with you if we can? The top question on the screen is, we are looking for development funding to convert several agricultural buildings into residential. Where is this best found, and is it easier or harder to find of late? Well, you may struggle to answer the where is it best found without going straight to a bank, but is it easier or harder to find of late? Can you answer that?
So if we're talking about development funding in isolation, then it is harder to find. The funding lines for development finance and bridging finance have been curtailed, without doubt. However, if we're looking at that from a farm or an estate perspective, then we would normally aim to be able to arrange that with more with a sort of conventional lender, either the lender that you're currently working with or with other lenders in that space, who would do that in the context of an overall estate or farm business. So that should deliver the most efficient outcome, best terms, best structure. and this feeds back into, you know, my argument about landed estates having this competitive advantage, is that Joe Bloggs out in the market who wants to go and develop those buildings in isolation will pay more, will find it hard to raise the money, may not be able to get as much funding as that farm or estate business, where the perceived capital cost for the lender is less. There's a wider relationship, and it's set against, Giles, really in your words, you know, a diversified business. So it's not just a business about property development. It covers all sorts of different sectors. So, you know, in that kind of scenario, every case we will look at independently to assess how we do it. And I'll just throw in, you know, one example, which is that often where you've got an estate business, let's say, and there are let residential properties, we might raise a buy-to-let mortgage against a let residential property, and the buy-to-let rates, I mean, are ridiculously low, well sub 2% for the right deals, and that can magic up the money, and off you go away and do what you want with it.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. Turning back to Liz, a quick question from me, if I may. We've heard in the newspapers that the biggest companies are looking at the furlough claims that they've made and saying, actually, we don't really need those, we're going to pay those back. Are you seeing any of our landed estate clients doing the same and just taking a view that furlough is free money, but ultimately it's not really worthy?
It's a really good question. I think the estates that I work with have all made use of the furlough scheme, and none that I'm aware of are actually thinking about paying that back at the moment, but that's not to say it won't change. And I think it's just really interesting how that highlights this sort of continuation of tax becoming a moral issue. So, you know, over the last sort of decade, we've really seen people saying, well, the rules might be this, but morally you should do this. And it's just a sort of another continuation of that, and the sort of bigger corporates making a decision of themselves as to what they think is appropriate.
Yeah, very interesting, and I think that's a very good answer, and I think we'll see more of that, won't we? The moral tax argument rather than the, with apologies to Simon, the legal tax argument as to what you can do, is what you should do. Simon, quickly, you mentioned at the start of the seminar that the country house market had, I think your words were taken off, and was still very strong. Is that location specific, or is it all over the country?
I think it's all over the country. Those people who would have lived in Chelsea are now moving to Surrey. Those people who would have been in Surrey are moving out to Hampshire, and the people in Hampshire are moving all the way down here, so to Devon and Cornwall. I see one of the questions related to paperless tickets and things, but I think people's working practices, they have realised that you don't have to be in your office in Canary Wharf all the time. And in fact, a lot of people have realised they don't have to be there at all, or just nip up to town. So I think there will be a major, it's very interesting to, which is not the subject of this at all, but you know, what's going to happen to the urban office environment. And I think there's going to be a big cutback on that. People can move their back offices out, but it will mean that a lot of people who would always have considered they needed to be a whisker away from their office in London to be there by 7 in the morning just aren't going to be.
Yeah, entirely fair. And we said we would try and finish it in 45 minutes, and we're pretty much bang on 45 minutes. So I'm just going to take the one final question, and I'm going to let each of the panelists, and even me as chairman, answer it in their own view, both from their own business and their own clients. So do the speakers think that COVID creates a powerful spur towards going even more paperless, both in terms of office management and in terms of tickets? And I'm going to take chairman's prerogative and answer first. The short answer is yes, and two quick examples. So Bidwells went paper light about 2 years ago, and I genuinely haven't used a piece of paper or printed anything for the last 4 months of COVID. So we have actually gone from paper light to paper completely free. And I think that will be a spur. We are now gently going back into the office, but we won't be back to the same working patterns as before, as Simon's already said. And it will be a very different way of working. The panelists came on slightly earlier just to make sure that there were no technical issues. And we all said that actually webinars are a fantastic way of communicating. Do you have to trek up to London to Saffrey's or Farrow's offices? No, actually this is perfect. You can communicate by webinar. And in terms of tickets, well, I went to my local pub last night and I was simply told, we don't do cash, we don't do menus. There's a QR code, a menu's on your phone. Please order, put your credit card details in, and we'll bring your food and your drink over. It worked perfectly. I didn't even have to move from my chair. So I think it will, and I'm very supportive. Mark, your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Giles. I'm first going to do Liz the honour of responding to her question that I forgot to answer, because I think it ties in quite nicely. In terms of banks and advancement for that, certainly I'm aware now that a lot of banks they feed their bank accounts into businesses' accounting packages, and so the managers of those businesses, be it estates or any other business, and mine included, can be fully in charge of what's happening financially in their business on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's a brilliant step forward. It could, of course, go back in the opposite direction, in that that same management information that the client has access to monitor their business could be openly and freely available back to the bank. And it may be that the banks will look for that going forward in the future. So we'll be much closer to what's happening on a day-to-day basis, rather than, if you think about it, the opening position for a bank is, we'd like to see your financial accounts in 227 days after the year end. So you're already at least 9 months, probably 12 months beyond the point in time. So that's going to be important. But on the sort of paperless business, yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely crucial that we take this opportunity and push it forward. Certainly, we as a business have found very significant greater efficiencies. I hope that the banks will also keep pushing that, because their systems typically are quite antiquated, underinvested. And I was having an interesting conversation with a senior banker earlier this week, and asking the question, obviously with all of the home working and the technology, etc., is that going to be retained in the future? And he wasn't really able to say definitively yes. It seemed there was a prospect that they might just slip back to where they were, rather than taking this opportunity to push forward. So I see it as enormously positive, and I think it's pushed us forward probably five years over 3 or 4 months.
Right, thanks, Mark. Liz, your thoughts on how COVID-19 spurred towards going even more paperless, tickets, officers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge push forward. Like Mark said, we've come so far in so little time compared to where we might have been otherwise. I mean, just from sort of HMRC's side, they announced that in respect of inheritance tax, which is an area that's always been quite antiquated in terms of how they want their forms and original signatures, and every trustee has got to sign everything. They announced during the lockdown that they would be a bit more lenient as to accepting documents and maybe accepting signed scanned signatures. So that was really welcome. Although I think they have reverted recently, saying, oh, actually, but we prefer it to be back to how it was. So again, like Mark was saying, sort of reverting back to the old way of working, which is a bit disappointing. But I mean, in terms of our own office, we've gone pretty much sort of paperless now. And we were already making moves towards that with things like the introduction of making tax digital, where, I mean, everything is going digital. And we were working to getting sort of electronic tax working paper files, rather than having these great big files of everyone's bank statements that they send in. So it's really accelerated that. And especially going forwards, we won't necessarily be able to have those paper files, because you've got to then worry about sort of quarantining the file, like we've been hearing about for the shops, where if you pick up something, it's got to then go into quarantine for 48 hours, or whatever it is. And then the final thing that Mark mentioned about banks getting the information on the people they've lent to via these sort of cloud accounting packages. There is actually a platform that's sort of arisen out of Australia, but they are very much focused on the agricultural sector. And someone was telling me that the banks in Australia one bank won't even lend to agricultural businesses unless they're using this platform, so that they can then go and get the information whenever they want it about how that business is performing. So it'll be really interesting to see how things like that develop over the coming months and years.
Thank you, Liz. And finally, Mr. Pring, as far as paperless, property transfers now paperless?
Well, you know, we tried, but no, you'd have to dream really to think that that was going to happen with lawyers going paperless. You know, we have the ability to be completely paperless. So sadly, gone are the days when we were paid by the yard of vellum. But we are having huge problems with that. One, because of the physical deeds that we have, but also persuading as a profession the land registry to accept digital signatures in a way that they haven't, and they're still not. So in fact, the whole profession's got professional support lawyers have bunched together and are constantly beating up the land registry to move this, to get them to move forward, because you know, we can't do this properly unless we can move away from a wet signature properly witnessed. And it's the same with the banks and mortgages and as Liz said, the probate registry. So we are really struggling to go absolutely paperless. And then you know, you get these documents, and then where do you put them? So but you know, we've made vast there've been vast improvements over, and this has pushed it along nicely, which is helpful.
Brilliant, thank you, Simon. Firstly, most importantly, thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to Liz, Simon and Mark for the preparation you put in and for your really valuable contribution this morning. Very grateful. Secondly, thanks to Tim Hopkin for inviting us to do this. Very enjoyable to put together and for the panelists to work together. Please do let Tim know of any more topics you think about as panelists or as guests and listeners. And finally, thanks very much to you as listeners. Thanks all for joining, and thanks for your interesting and thought-provoking questions. I hope you have a good weekend. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and goodbye.